Next prison to the soul. 1. The gilded cage. 2. Whispers in the dark. 3. The consultation. 4. The journal. 5. The unraveling. 6. The collector. 7. The feeding. 8. The awakening. 9. The descent. 10. The haunting. 11. The reckoning. 12. The call to arms. 13. The convergence. 14. The codex of binding. 15. Beyond mortal law. 16. The summons. 17. The hunt. 18. The Berlin Protocols. 19. The Genesis Protocol. 20. The Immutable Code. 21. The Enforcement Paradox. 22. The Betrayal. 23. The Equilibrium. 24. The Sentencing. Next prison to the soul. Sinclair and Associates. The Gilded Cage. Whispers in the Dark. The Feeding. 215, 135. 1. The Gilded Cage, 10. 1, 5. 2, 5. 2. Whispers in the Dark, 8. 1, 4. Sinclair and Associates. 2, 4. 3. The Consultation, 10. 1, 6. 2, 4. 4. The Journal, 8. 1, 4. 2, 4. 5. The Unraveling, 10. 1, 5. 2, 5. 6. The Collector, 10. 1, 10. 7. The Feeding, 12. 1, 12. 8. The Awakening, 8. 1, 4. 2, 4. 9. The Descent, 10. 1, 10. 10. The Haunting, 8. 1, 8. 11. The Reckoning, 8. 1, 8. 12. The Call to Arms, 8. 1, 8. 13. The Convergence, 8. 1, 8. 14. The Codex of Binding, 8. 1, 8. 15. Beyond Mortal Law, 6. 1, 6. 16. The Summons, 6. 1, 6. 17. The Hunt, 6. 1, 6. 18. The Berlin Protocols, 6. 1, 6. 19. The Genesis Protocol, 8. 1, 8. 20. The Immutable Code, 6. 1, 6. 21. The Enforcement Paradox, 6. 1, 6. 22. The Betrayal, 8. 1, 8. 23. The Equilibrium, 10. 1, 10. 24. The Sentencing, 8. 1, 8. 135. Next prison to the soul. Chapter 1. The Gilded Cage. The crystal chandelier cast fractured rainbows across the marble floor of the Sinclair mansion, but Lydia Sinclair saw only shadows. She stood at the grand staircase's landing, her silk nightgown clinging to her trembling form as another sleepless night stretched before her. The dreams had started 3 months ago, visions so vivid and terrifying that she could no longer distinguish between sleep and waking horror. Lydia. Marcus Sinclair's voice echoed from their bedroom, thick with exhaustion. Come back to bed, darling. She pressed her palm against the cool marble banister, feeling the familiar dread creep up her spine. How could she explain that their bed had become a portal to nightmares? That every time she closed her eyes, she saw their life unraveling in ways too grotesque to comprehend? The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed midnight, its deep resonance seeming to awaken something malevolent in the house's shadows. Lydia's breath caught as she glimpsed a figure moving in the darkness below, tall, feminine, with eyes that gleamed like polished obsidian. Francesca Everhart materialized from the shadows as if she belonged there, her business attire immaculate despite the late hour. Marcus's business partner had been spending more time at their home lately, always with some urgent matter requiring immediate attention. But tonight, something was different about Francesca's presence, something that made Lydia's skin crawl with recognition. "Mrs. Sinclair," Francesca's voice drifted up the staircase like smoke. "Still having trouble sleeping?" Chapter 2, Whispers in the Dark. The boardroom of Sinclair and Associates felt smaller each day, as if the walls were slowly contracting around Marcus's sanity. He sat across from Francesca, watching her manicured fingers trace patterns on the mahogany table, patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when he wasn't looking directly at them. "The Henderson account is progressing beautifully," Francesca said, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "Though I'm concerned about your focus lately, Marcus. The dreams are affecting your work." Marcus's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as his hand trembled. How did she know about the dreams? He'd never mentioned them to anyone except Lydia, and even then, only in whispered fragments during their shared insomnia. In his nightmares, he saw Lydia's beautiful face contorted with terror, her green eyes pleading as unseen forces dragged her into darkness. He saw their home transformed into a labyrinth of corridors that led nowhere, filled with the sound of weeping that seemed to come from the walls themselves. And always, there was Francesca watching from doorways that shouldn't exist, smiling that cold smile. "Perhaps you should take some time off," Francesca continued, leaning forward. "Spend more time with that lovely wife of yours. I could handle things here." The suggestion felt like a trap, but Marcus found himself nodding. The exhaustion was becoming unbearable, and Lydia needed him. She'd grown pale and fragile, jumping at shadows and refusing to be alone in certain rooms of their house. That evening, Marcus found Lydia in their garden, kneeling among the roses she'd once loved. The flowers had begun to wither despite the perfect weather, their petals blackening at the edges as if touched by frost. "They're dying," she whispered without looking up. "Everything beautiful dies here now." Marcus knelt beside her, pulling her into his arms. Her body felt cold despite the warm evening air, and when she looked at him, he saw his own terror reflected in her eyes. "We need help," she said. "Professional help. These aren't just nightmares, Marcus. Something is happening to us." Chapter 3, The Consultation. Dr. Helena Marsh's office felt like a sanctuary compared to the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over the Sinclair home. The psychiatrist listened patiently as Marcus and Lydia described their shared torment, her pen moving steadily across her notepad. "Shared nightmares aren't uncommon in couples experiencing severe stress," Dr. Marsh explained. "The mind can create remarkably similar imagery when two people are living through the same traumatic experiences." But even as she spoke the words, Lydia could see doubt flickering in the doctor's eyes. There was something about their case that didn't fit the textbook explanations, something that made the professional facade crack just slightly. "Tell me about your business partner," Dr. Marsh said to Marcus. "Francesca Everhart. She features prominently in both of your accounts." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Francesca is intense. Brilliant, but intense. She joined the firm 2 years ago, and our profits have tripled since then. But lately, she's everywhere," Lydia finished. "In our home, in our dreams, in our thoughts. It's like she's becoming part of us." Dr. Marsh set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. "I'm going to recommend a course of treatment that might seem unconventional. I want you to document everything, every dream, every interaction with Ms. Everhart, every strange occurrence in your home. Sometimes patterns emerge that aren't immediately obvious." As they left the office, Lydia felt a momentary lightening of the weight on her chest. Perhaps there was hope after all. But as they reached their car, she saw Francesca's black sedan parked across the street, and her brief optimism crumbled. Francesca rolled down her window and smiled. "How did the appointment go? I do hope Dr. Marsh was helpful." The fact that she knew where they'd been, what they'd been doing, sent ice through Lydia's veins. Marcus's face had gone ashen, and his hands shook as he fumbled with the car keys. "We should go," he whispered. But as they drove away, Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that they were only postponing the inevitable, that whatever Francesca wanted from them, she would eventually take. Chapter 4, The Journal. Lydia's handwriting had grown increasingly erratic as the days passed, her elegant script deteriorating into desperate scrawls across the pages of the leather-bound journal Dr. Marsh had recommended. She sat in the morning sunlight streaming through their bedroom window, but even the golden rays felt cold against her skin. Day 12, the dreams are getting worse. Last night I dreamed I was trapped in our house, but it wasn't our house. The rooms kept changing, multiplying. I could hear Marcus calling for me, but every door I opened led to another corridor. And at the end of each hallway, Francesca was waiting. She was wearing my wedding dress, but it was stained with something dark. When I woke up, Marcus was gone. I found him in the kitchen, making coffee for 3 people. He didn't remember doing it. She paused, her pen hovering over the page as footsteps echoed from downstairs. Marcus was supposed to be at the office, but the sound was too light to be his heavy stride. Too deliberate to be accidental. Day 12, continued. She's in the house again. I can feel her presence like a cold draft. The roses in the garden are completely black now, and yesterday I found dead birds arranged in perfect circles around the fountain. Marcus says I'm imagining things, but I know what I see. I know what I feel. The footsteps had stopped directly below her room. Lydia held her breath, straining to hear any other sound, but the house had fallen into an unnatural silence. Even the usual creaking of old wood and settling foundations had ceased. She crept to the window and peered down at the driveway. Francesca's car wasn't there, but that meant nothing. The woman seemed capable of appearing and disappearing at will, like smoke given form. A soft knock at the bedroom door made Lydia's heart leap into her throat. Lydia. Francesca's voice was honey-sweet, concerned. Are you feeling all right? You look so pale lately. The door handle turned slowly, though Lydia was certain she'd locked it. Francesca entered without invitation, her dark eyes immediately finding the journal in Lydia's hands. Writing can be so therapeutic, Francesca said, moving closer with predatory grace. I'd love to read what you've been working on. It's private, Lydia managed, clutching the journal to her chest. Francesca's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. Nothing is private between friends, Lydia. Chapter 5, The Unraveling. Marcus found himself standing in his office at 3 in the morning, with no memory of how he'd gotten there. The building was locked, the security system armed, yet here he was fully dressed in yesterday's clothes, his hands stained with something that looked disturbingly like soil. The Henderson files were spread across his desk in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Numbers and letters seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when he tried to focus, forming words in a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood. The contracts bore signatures that weren't quite right, his own name written in handwriting that was almost, but not entirely, his. A soft scratching sound drew his attention to the walls. The sound of fingernails against wood, slow and deliberate. As he watched in growing horror, thin cracks began to appear in the mahogany paneling, spreading like spider webs across the surface. From within the cracks, something dark began to seep, not blood, but something thicker, more viscous. His phone buzzed with a text from Lydia. Where are you? The house is making sounds. Please come home. But when he tried to leave, the elevator wouldn't respond to his calls. The stairwell door was locked from the inside, though that should have been impossible. And in the reflection of the darkened windows, he could see Francesca standing behind him, though when he turned around, the office was empty. You're learning, her voice whispered from everywhere and nowhere. Soon you'll understand what you really signed when you made me your partner. Meanwhile, Lydia had barricaded herself in the master bathroom, the only room in the house where the walls didn't seem to breathe. The journal lay open beside her, its pages now filling themselves with words she hadn't written, words that described her own death in meticulous, loving detail. The mirror above the sink had begun to fog despite the dry air, and in the condensation, a message appeared letter by letter, "Let me in." But the most terrifying part wasn't the supernatural manifestations or the impossible occurrences. It was the growing certainty that some part of her, some deep, hidden part, wanted to open the door and surrender to whatever Francesca truly was. The house shuddered around her like a living thing in pain, and Lydia realized with crystalline clarity that they had never been the owners of this place. They had always been the prisoners. Chapter 6, The Collector. Francesca Everhart had been collecting souls for 3 centuries, but Marcus Sinclair represented something special, a perfect specimen of ambition wrapped in moral decay, seasoned with just enough conscience to make the corruption exquisite. She stood in her private study, a room that existed in the spaces between reality's cracks, surrounded by glass cases containing her most prized acquisitions. Each vessel held the essence of someone who had once been whole, their dreams and desires crystallized into beautiful, terrible artifacts. The opera singer's case hummed with unfinished arias. The painters swirled with colors that had never existed in the mortal realm. The bankers pulsed with golden light that felt cold to the touch. But the case she'd prepared for Marcus was different, larger, more ornate, with silver filigree that seemed to move when observed peripherally. She'd been cultivating him for 2 years, slowly introducing chaos into his ordered life, watching him make increasingly desperate choices to maintain his facade of success. The Henderson account had been her masterpiece of manipulation. Every signature Marcus had unknowingly forged, every document he'd falsified to cover Francesca's errors, had bound him deeper to her web. He thought he was protecting his reputation, his marriage, his carefully constructed life. He had no idea he was signing away pieces of his soul with each compromise. Francesca traced her finger along the rim of Marcus's future prison, savoring the anticipation. She could already taste his essence: ambition curdled with guilt, love twisted into possessiveness, hope fermenting into despair. He would make a particularly fine vintage. The beauty of her method lay in its elegance. She never forced her victims to fall, she simply created the conditions where falling became inevitable. Marcus had chosen to trust her, chosen to let her into his business, chosen to ignore the warning signs that had made Lydia so deliciously paranoid. Every choice had been his, even as she'd carefully orchestrated each option. Through the ethereal window of her study, she could see into the Sinclair home, where Lydia cowered behind her bathroom door. The wife had proven more resistant than expected. Her love for Marcus created a kind of spiritual armor that was proving troublesome to penetrate. But Francesca had dealt with protective spouses before. They always broke eventually, usually in the most spectacular ways. She smiled, remembering the Victorian gentleman whose wife had tried to save him through prayer. The woman had ended up clawing her own eyes out rather than watch what her husband became. Or the modern businessman whose husband had attempted an intervention. He'd thrown himself from their penthouse balcony when he realized what his beloved had transformed into. Lydia would break soon enough. And when she did, her anguish would season Marcus's soul with the perfect note of tragedy. Francesca pressed her palm against Marcus's waiting case, feeling it pulse with hungry anticipation. Soon, very soon, she would add another masterpiece to her collection. And this time, she would savor every moment of the harvest. Chapter 7, The Feeding. Marcus woke to find himself standing in the basement of their home, a basement that hadn't existed when they'd bought the house. The walls were carved from living rock, slick with moisture that reflected the flickering light of candles arranged in precise geometric patterns. His bare feet were numb against the stone floor, and when he looked down, he saw symbols carved into his own flesh, fresh wounds that should have been agonizing but felt like nothing at all. Lydia hung suspended in the center of the chamber, her wrists bound with chains that seemed to grow from the ceiling itself. Her nightgown was torn, revealing more of the same symbols etched across her pale skin. Her eyes were open but vacant, staring at something beyond the physical realm. Beautiful work, don't you think? Francesca emerged from the shadows, no longer bothering to maintain her human facade. Her skin had taken on a translucent quality, revealing the dark network of veins beneath. Her fingers had elongated into razor-sharp talons, and when she smiled, her mouth opened far wider than anatomy should have allowed. Marcus tried to speak, to move, to scream, but found himself paralyzed. Only his eyes could move, darting frantically between his suspended wife and the creature that had been masquerading as his business partner. The preparation has taken months, Francesca continued, circling Lydia's motionless form like a predator savoring its kill. Each nightmare, each moment of terror, each compromise you made, all of it was feeding the ritual. You've been so wonderfully cooperative. She dragged one talon across Lydia's cheek, drawing a thin line of blood that began to glow with an otherworldly light. Lydia's body convulsed, and a sound escaped her lips, not quite human, not quite animal. The beauty of married couples, Francesca purred, is how their souls intertwine. When I harvest one, I get echoes of the other. Flavors of shared memories, shared dreams, shared love. It makes the essence so much richer. Marcus watched in horror as tendrils of light began to seep from Lydia's wounds, floating through the air like luminous smoke. Francesca breathed them in deeply, her eyes rolling back in ecstasy. With each breath she took, Lydia seemed to fade, becoming more translucent. "Don't worry, Marcus," Francesca said, turning her attention to him. "You'll join her soon enough. But first, I want you to watch. I want you to understand exactly what your ambition has cost. Every shortcut you took, every lie you told, every document you falsified, it all led here. To this moment. To this choice you made without even knowing you were making it." The candles flared brighter, and Marcus felt something fundamental beginning to tear loose inside his chest. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was Lydia's eyes focusing on his face, filled with a love so pure it burned brighter than the hellfire consuming them both. Chapter 8, The Awakening. Marcus's eyes snapped open to the sound of his own screaming. He was back in their bedroom, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, his throat raw from the sounds he'd been making. Beside him, Lydia sat bolt upright, her face a mask of terror that mirrored his own. "The basement," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You saw it too." They stared at each other in the pre-dawn darkness, both afraid to voice what they'd experienced. The dream had been too vivid, too detailed, too synchronized to be mere nightmare. Marcus could still feel the phantom pain of the carved symbols, could still taste the metallic tang of fear on his tongue. Lydia's trembling hand found his. "We have to check." They crept through their house like intruders in their own home, every shadow seeming to writhe with malevolent intent. The hardwood floors creaked accusations beneath their feet. When they reached the door that should have led to their storage closet, they found instead a heavy wooden barrier marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The door was warm to the touch, pulsing like a heartbeat. "This wasn't here yesterday," Marcus breathed, though even as he said it, he couldn't be certain. His memories felt unreliable, edited by an unseen hand. From behind the door came the sound of dripping water and something else, a wet, sliding noise like flesh being dragged across stone. Lydia pressed her ear to the wood and immediately jerked back, her face white with revulsion. "There's something moving down there," she gasped. "Something big." The handle turned without either of them touching it. Cool air wafted up from below, carrying with it the stench of decay and something sweetly chemical that made their eyes water. Stone steps descended into absolute darkness, worn smooth by centuries of use. On the walls, the same symbols from their shared nightmare glowed with a faint phosphorescence. "We should call the police," Lydia said, but her voice carried no conviction. What could they possibly tell them? That their house had grown a basement overnight? That their business partner was harvesting souls? A sound echoed from the depths, Francesca's laughter, rich and triumphant. But underneath it was something else, a chorus of voices crying out in languages both ancient and unborn. The collected screams of everyone who had ever descended those steps and never returned. Marcus felt his feet moving toward the stairs against his will, drawn by an compulsion that seemed to emanate from his very bones. Lydia grabbed his arm, but her grip was weak, as if the strength was being drained from her body. "She's calling us home," Lydia whispered, and Marcus realized with dawning horror that part of her wanted to answer that call. Part of both of them did. The basement was waiting, patient as a grave, hungry as the void between stars. Chapter 9, The Descent. The stone steps were slick with something that wasn't water. Marcus's bare feet slipped on the third step, and when he caught himself against the wall, his palm came away black with a substance that moved like liquid mercury. It burned against his skin, leaving behind marks that matched the symbols carved throughout the basement. Lydia followed behind him, her breathing shallow and rapid. The air grew thicker with each step, pressing against their lungs like wet cotton. The walls seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, and in the phosphorescent glow of the symbols, they could see things moving within the stone itself, shapes that might once have been human, now twisted into impossible configurations. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement opened into a vast chamber that defied the dimensions of their house. Dozens of glass cases lined the walls, each one containing a swirling mass of light that writhed and screamed silently against its prison. The cases were labeled with names, dates, and brief descriptions written in Francesca's elegant script. Thomas Whitmore, 1847, Pride. Sarah Chen, 1993, Greed. Michael Torres, 2019, Wrath. In the center of the chamber stood an altar carved from what looked like human bone, its surface stained dark with centuries of use. Francesca waited beside it, no longer maintaining any pretense of humanity. Her skin had become translucent, revealing the dark network of veins that pulsed with stolen life. Her limbs had elongated grotesquely, and her face had stretched into something that was almost insectoid in its alien geometry. "Welcome to my collection," she said, her voice now a harmony of all the souls she'd consumed. "You've been such perfect specimens. The way you've suffered, the way you've fought against the inevitable, it's seasoned your essence beautifully." Lydia tried to run, but her feet wouldn't obey. Looking down, she saw that roots had burst through the stone floor, wrapping around her ankles and climbing up her legs. Where they touched her skin, her flesh began to blacken and crack, revealing the same phosphorescent glow that emanated from the walls. Marcus lunged toward Francesca, but she moved with inhuman speed, her elongated fingers piercing his chest with surgical precision. He looked down to see her hand buried in his ribcage, her talons wrapped around his still beating heart. "The beautiful thing about married couples," Francesca whispered, her breath hot against his ear, "is that they die together." She squeezed, and Marcus felt his heart burst like an overripe fruit. Blood poured from his mouth as he collapsed, his vision dimming. But death didn't bring relief. Instead, he felt himself being pulled apart at a molecular level, his consciousness fragmenting into 1,000 screaming pieces. Lydia's screams echoed through the chamber as the roots continued their climb, now reaching her chest. Where they penetrated her skin, flowers bloomed, beautiful white roses that immediately began to wither and turn black. Her blood fed the hungry earth, and with each drop, more of her soul was torn away. "Please," she gasped, her voice barely human now. "Please, just let us die." Francesca's laughter was the sound of breaking glass and dying stars. "Death is for the fortunate, my dear. You're going to live forever as part of my collection. Every scream, every moment of agony, preserved in crystal for my eternal enjoyment." The last thing Lydia saw before the darkness claimed her was Marcus's lifeless body being dragged toward one of the empty cases, his essence already beginning to condense into the swirling light that would become his prison. The basement fell silent except for the soft sound of 2 new cases sealing shut, and the satisfied sigh of a creature that had fed well. Chapter 10, The Haunting. The Hendersons moved into the Sinclair mansion 3 months after the disappearance. The realtor had been eager to sell, the price dropping with each week the house sat empty. Detective Sarah Morrison and her husband David thought they'd found their dream home: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and a garden that would be perfect once they cleared away the dead roses. They didn't know about the basement. The door had sealed itself, becoming just another section of wall. But the dead don't rest easy in houses built on suffering. Sarah first saw Marcus on their second night. He stood at the foot of their bed, his chest a gaping wound that wept phosphorescent blood onto the Persian rug. His mouth moved soundlessly, trying to warn them, but only black ichor poured from his lips. When Sarah blinked, he was gone, leaving only the stench of decay and the wet outline of his feet burned into the floor. David began sleepwalking. Sarah would find him in the kitchen, methodically sharpening every knife they owned while humming a lullaby in Lydia's voice. His eyes were open but rolled back white, and when she touched his shoulder, his skin was ice cold. He never remembered these episodes, but each morning brought fresh cuts on his hands, precise, deliberate wounds that spelled out letters in a language neither of them recognized. The house began to change them. Sarah's reflection in the bathroom mirror showed Francesca's face superimposed over her own, the features bleeding together until she couldn't tell where she ended and the demon began. She would catch herself signing documents she'd never seen, making phone calls to numbers that didn't exist, speaking in voices that weren't her own. David's personality fractured like shattered glass. One moment he was the gentle man she'd married, the next he was Marcus, desperate, paranoid, clawing at his own skin to remove symbols that weren't there. He would grab Sarah's throat with trembling hands, his face contorting with Marcus's memories of betrayal and loss, then collapse sobbing as his own consciousness fought to resurface. The ghosts were hungry. They pressed against the barriers between life and death, trying to claw their way back into flesh and bone. Marcus's spirit invaded David's dreams, showing him visions of Francesca's collection, whispering secrets about the contracts that bound souls to servitude. Lydia's essence seeped into Sarah's mind like poison, filling her thoughts with images of roots and roses, of blood feeding the hungry earth. But the worst part wasn't the possession, it was the compulsion. Sarah would find herself standing over David while he slept, kitchen knife raised above his heart, her hand trembling with the effort of resisting Lydia's whispered commands. David would wake with his fingers wrapped around Sarah's throat, Marcus's rage burning behind his eyes as he squeezed just hard enough to leave bruises. They tried to kill each other nightly now. The attempts were clumsy, desperate, more like elaborate suicide pacts than murders. But each time the blade found flesh or the rope tightened around a throat, their wounds would heal instantly, leaving only the memory of agony and the growing certainty that death was no longer an option. The house wouldn't let them die. It needed them alive, needed their terror and suffering to feed the things that dwelt in its walls. Their blood would water the garden where black roses bloomed. Their screams would echo through corridors that existed in the spaces between dimensions. In the basement that was no longer there, two glass cases pulsed with increasing urgency. The souls trapped within pressed against their crystal prisons, desperate to escape, to inhabit new flesh, to live again even if it meant damning the innocent. And in the shadows between shadows, Francesca smiled and prepared two more cases. The collection was growing. Chapter 11, The Reckoning. Francesca's black Ford Mustang roared through the night, its engine screaming against the supernatural forces that tried to drag it back toward the mansion. For the first time in 3 centuries, she was running not from mortal authorities or rival demons, but from something far more terrifying, the collective rage of every soul she'd ever harvested. The car's headlights cut through darkness that seemed to move with malevolent purpose. Shadows reached across the road like grasping fingers, trying to pull her vehicle into the void between worlds. In the rearview mirror, she could see them, dozens of spectral forms giving chase, their faces twisted with centuries of accumulated hatred. Marcus led the pack, his ghostly form more solid than it should have been, his chest wound blazing with righteous fury. Beside him ran Lydia, her ethereal dress trailing roots and thorns that left burning gouges in the asphalt. Behind them came the others, all of Francesca's victims, united in their thirst for revenge. The mansion's windows blazed with unnatural light as she approached, and she realized with growing horror that her carefully constructed prison had become a beacon, calling every damned soul home. The basement door had torn itself open, and her precious collection was escaping en masse. She slammed on the brakes, the Mustang skidding to a halt in the circular driveway. The shadows converged on her immediately, pressing against the car's windows like living smoke. Through the writhing darkness, she could see Sarah and David Henderson standing on the front steps, but they weren't alone. Marcus's spirit had fully possessed David, his features overlaying the detective's face like a double exposure. His eyes burned with the accumulated rage of the damned, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every soul Francesca had tortured. "Your collection is free," he said, his words echoing with supernatural power. "And now it's time for you to join it." Lydia's essence flowed through Sarah like liquid moonlight, transforming the woman into something both beautiful and terrible. Roses bloomed in her hair, white ones this time, pure and untainted. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the harmony of every prayer ever whispered in desperation. "We have faith," she said, and the word struck Francesca like a physical blow. "Faith in justice. Faith in redemption. Faith that even the darkest soul can be redeemed through suffering." The car doors wouldn't open. The engine wouldn't start. Francesca was trapped in a prison of her own making, surrounded by the very forces she'd spent centuries manipulating. The shadows pressed closer, and she could feel her carefully maintained form beginning to unravel. For the first time in her immortal existence, Francesca Everhart knew fear. The reckoning had begun. Chapter 12, The Call to Arms. Francesca's fingers trembled as she dialed the encrypted number she'd sworn never to use. The phone rang twice before a gravelly voice answered from a secure bunker beneath Washington, D.C. "Blackwater Division. This is Commander Hayes." "It's Everhart," she gasped, pressing herself against the car's back seat as spectral claws scraped against the windows. "I need immediate extraction. The containment has failed." A pause. "Impossible. Your collection was supposed to be permanent." "The shadows have turned," Francesca hissed, watching as the ghostly army circled her vehicle like wolves. "They're not just angry, they're organized. They're learning to manipulate reality itself. If this spreads beyond the mansion..." Commander Hayes's voice sharpened. "Are you telling me we have a Class 5 supernatural breach?" Through the windshield, Francesca watched Marcus raise his ethereal hand. The streetlights began exploding one by one, plunging the neighborhood into darkness that moved and breathed. In that darkness, she could see other shapes stirring, not just her victims, but older things, ancient horrors that had been sleeping in the spaces between worlds. "Worse," she whispered. "The shadows are recruiting. Every ghost, every restless spirit within 100 miles, they're all coming here. And they're not just seeking revenge against me anymore. They want to tear down the veil between life and death entirely." The line crackled with static as Hayes processed this information. In the background, Francesca could hear alarms beginning to sound, the scrambling of boots on concrete floors. "We're sending in the Wraith Division," Hayes finally said. "ETA 15 minutes. Try to stay alive until then." But as Francesca looked out at the growing army of the damned, she wondered if 15 minutes would be enough or if it was already too late to stop what she had unleashed. The shadows pressed closer, and in their depths, she glimpsed something that made her immortal blood run cold, the outline of doors opening to dimensions that should have remained forever sealed. Chapter 13, The Convergence. The mansion's walls began to buckle and warp as raw supernatural energy tore through the structure like acid through flesh. Rooms folded in on themselves, their geometric impossibilities creating corridors that led to yesterday and doorways that opened onto tomorrow. The grand staircase twisted into a spiral that descended infinitely downward, while the crystal chandelier melted upward into the ceiling, its fractured light casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. Souls poured from every crack in reality, not just Francesca's collection, but centuries of accumulated spiritual residue that had been trapped within the house's foundations. They streamed out like luminous smoke, some taking flight toward the city beyond, others diving deep into the earth to wake things that had slumbered since before human memory. Downtown, the first wave of possession began. Police officer Janet Mills found herself standing in the middle of Main Street at 3 a.m., directing traffic that didn't exist while speaking in a language that predated written history. Her eyes had rolled back white, and when concerned citizens approached her, she would grab their hands and whisper prophecies of the coming darkness in voices that weren't her own. At Mercy General Hospital, Dr. Richard Chen walked through the ICU unplugging life support machines while humming a lullaby that made the surviving patients weep uncontrollably. The nurses who tried to stop him found themselves frozen in place, their minds suddenly flooded with memories of deaths they'd never witnessed, surgeries they'd never performed. The city's population of nearly 50,000 had become unwitting vessels for the displaced dead, their consciousness submerged beneath waves of spectral invasion. They moved through the streets in coordinated patterns, their individual wills subordinated to a collective hunger for revenge against the living world that had forgotten them. Marcus's spirit, still anchored to David Henderson's body, stood in the mansion's collapsing foyer and felt the weight of command settling on his ethereal shoulders. Every escaped soul looked to him for guidance, drawn by the purity of his rage and the strength of his love for Lydia. He had become something more than a ghost. He was their general in a war against the forces that had imprisoned them. But even as he marshaled the army of the damned, Marcus knew they were running out of time. The hypnotic influence spreading through the city was like a cancer, growing stronger with each new host. Soon the possessed citizens would turn on each other, and the streets would run red with blood spilled by hands that no longer belonged to their owners. The sound of helicopters approaching from the east made him look up through the mansion's dissolving roof. Black aircraft cut through the night sky, their running lights dark, their presence announced only by the rhythmic thunder of rotor blades. On their sides, barely visible against the matte paint, was the symbol of a raven clutching a sword, the insignia of forces that dealt with threats beyond mortal comprehension. Francesca had called in her allies. The final battle was about to begin, and Marcus realized with crystalline clarity that victory would require a sacrifice none of them were prepared to make. To stop the spreading possession, to save the innocent people of the city, someone would have to willingly return to the void and take all the escaped souls with them. The question was, who among the damned still possessed enough humanity to choose salvation over revenge? Chapter 14, The Codex of Binding. In the basement of the federal building, 3 floors beneath the city's courthouse, Agent Rebecca Torres spread ancient legal documents across a steel table while the world above descended into chaos. The Wraith Division's archives contained texts that predated constitutional law by millennia, binding contracts written in blood and starlight, judicial precedents established by civilizations that had learned to legislate the supernatural. The Mesopotamian Accords, she muttered, her fingers tracing symbols that seemed to writhe beneath the parchment's surface. The Salem statutory restrictions. The Vatican's Codex Spiritum. Each document represented humanity's attempts to create legal frameworks for containing forces beyond mortal comprehension. Commander Hayes burst through the reinforced doors, his tactical gear splattered with something that glowed phosphorescent blue. The possession rate is accelerating. We've got maybe an hour before the entire city becomes a vessel for the dead. Torres looked up from the ancient texts, her eyes bright with desperate hope. There's precedent here. The witch trials weren't just persecution, they were enforcement of supernatural law. Judge Samuel Sewell didn't just condemn souls to death, he bound them legally to specific jurisdictions. The spirits couldn't cross territorial boundaries without violating celestial statute. She pulled out a leather-bound volume that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The Codex of Binding. It's written in 17 different languages, including 3 that were spoken by angels before the fall. According to this, any supernatural entity operating within human legal jurisdiction can be subject to terrestrial law if the proper judicial procedures are followed. Hayes stared at the incomprehensible text. You're talking about putting ghosts on trial. Not ghosts, Torres corrected, her voice gaining strength. Francesca Everhart. She's still the nexus point, the one who created the initial breach. If we can establish legal standing, if we can prove she violated the fundamental laws that separate the living from the dead, then we can invoke judicial binding. The building shuddered as another wave of supernatural energy swept through the city. Through the reinforced windows, they could see the courthouse steps beginning to crack, revealing glimpses of a courtroom that existed in dimensions beyond the physical. The shadows respond to authority, Torres continued, her hands moving frantically through the ancient documents. But it has to be legitimate authority, recognized by both mortal and immortal law. We need a judge who can preside over supernatural defendants. We need prosecutors who understand celestial jurisprudence. And we need to do it before the possessed citizens tear each other apart. Hayes activated his radio. All units, converge on the courthouse. We're going to trial. In the distance, the sound of breaking glass and inhuman screaming echoed through the night as the city's legal system prepared to confront forces that had never been subject to human justice. The law itself was about to become humanity's last weapon against the darkness. Chapter 15, Beyond Mortal Law. The shadows that poured from the mansion's broken foundation moved like liquid night across the heavens, defying gravity and earthly physics with contemptuous ease. Agent Torres watched through the courthouse windows as her carefully researched legal precedents crumbled to ash. The ancient laws meant nothing to forces that existed outside the very concept of jurisdiction. "The binding isn't working," she whispered, her voice hollow with defeat. The Codex of Binding lay open on the table, its pages now blank as if the words themselves had fled in terror. Commander Hayes lowered his radio, his face grim. "All units report the same thing. The shadows are ignoring every containment protocol we have. They're not subject to human authority, they never were." Through the chaos of the possessed city, two figures moved with purpose that cut through the supernatural storm like beacons of pure intention. Lydia's spirit, still flowing through Sarah Henderson's transformed body, walked down Main Street with roses blooming in her wake, but these flowers were different now, their petals shimmering with an inner light that made the shadows recoil. Beside her, Marcus's essence had evolved beyond mere possession of David Henderson. His form blazed with an energy that was neither living nor dead, but something entirely new, the power of a soul that had chosen love over vengeance, sacrifice over revenge. Where they walked, the possessed citizens stopped their frenzied attacks. The shadows that had been driving them to violence simply dissipated. Not destroyed, not banished, but transformed into something else entirely, threads of light that wove themselves into the fabric of reality, healing the tears between dimensions. "They're not fighting the darkness," Torres realized, watching the impossible scene unfold. "They're absorbing it. Transforming it." The shadows in the sky began to spiral downward, drawn by an irresistible force that had nothing to do with laws or judgments. It was older than jurisprudence, more fundamental than any legal system ever devised by mortal minds. It was the simple, terrible power of souls who had learned to forgive even their destroyer. Chapter 16, The Summons. Marcus's ethereal form flickered as an unfamiliar compulsion seized him, not the desperate hunger of the damned or the righteous fury that had driven his army of spirits, but something far more mundane and infinitely more disturbing. He found himself walking through the transformed city streets, past the still possessed citizens and the swirling shadows, toward the commercial district that had somehow remained untouched by the supernatural chaos. The compulsion led him to Henderson and Associates, the law firm that had once handled the Sinclair estate. Through the plate glass windows, he could see Judge Patricia Blackwood sitting behind a mahogany desk that hadn't been there yesterday, her black robes pristine despite the apocalyptic events unfolding outside. "Mr. Sinclair," she said without looking up from the documents spread before her. "You're late." Marcus's spectral form solidified as he entered the office, his ethereal wounds becoming flesh once more. He looked down at his hands, solid, warm, bleeding. Somehow, impossibly, he was alive again. "There seems to be a problem with your adequately managing the supernatural assets under your jurisdiction," Judge Blackwood continued, her pen scratching across legal forms that hurt to look at directly. "The policy department has expressed concerns about your methods of control." The words made no sense, yet Marcus found himself nodding, understanding flooding through him like ice water. He was responsible now not just for the escaped souls, but for maintaining the delicate balance between the living and the dead. The transformation he'd undergone had made him something new, a supernatural administrator, bound by rules he didn't understand to serve masters he'd never met. "You need to stay on the good side of the people, Mr. Sinclair," the judge said, finally looking up with eyes that held depths of legal precedent stretching back to the foundation of reality itself. "Provide correct management without problems. The policy would very much like to control this situation before it spreads beyond our current containment parameters." She slid a clipboard across the desk. The forms were written in that same shifting language he'd seen in Francesca's contracts, but now he could read every word with perfect clarity. Terms of employment. Supernatural regulatory compliance. Jurisdictional boundaries for interdimensional management. "The shops, Mr. Sinclair," Judge Blackwood said, her voice carrying the weight of cosmic authority. "You'll need to visit the shops. There are acquisitions to be made. Resources to be allocated. The situation requires immediate attention." Marcus signed his name at the bottom of the forms, each letter binding him deeper into a bureaucracy that existed in the spaces between life and death. As the ink dried, he felt his newfound freedom slipping away, replaced by the crushing weight of supernatural middle management. Outside the window, the city continued its descent into chaos, but now it was his responsibility to file the proper reports. Chapter 17, The Hunt. Detective Morrison's patrol unit screamed through the possessed streets, her radio crackling with reports of officers turning on their own partners. The shadows had learned to weaponize authority itself. Every badge became a conduit for darkness, every uniform a vessel for the vengeful dead. "Unit 47 to dispatch," came a voice over the radio, but the words were spoken in reverse, the officer's consciousness submerged beneath layers of spectral possession. "We have multiple suspects fleeing into the commercial district. Requesting backup for supernatural apprehension." Sarah Morrison, or what remained of her beneath Lydia's spiritual influence, pressed the accelerator harder. Through her fragmented awareness, she could sense the other officers converging on Henderson and Associates, their minds twisted by shadow whispers that promised justice through violence. Officer Jake Martinez burst through the law firm's glass doors, his service weapon drawn but his eyes rolled back white. The shadows that controlled him spoke through his mouth in languages that predated human speech, demanding Francesca Everhart's immediate surrender for crimes against the natural order. But Francesca was no longer there. Only Judge Blackwood remained, calmly reviewing Marcus's signed contracts while chaos erupted around her. "Detective Morrison seeks communication with the defendant," Martinez announced, his voice layered with the screams of a dozen possessed souls. "The law demands answers about the breach of supernatural jurisdiction." The judge looked up with mild interest. "I'm afraid Miss Everhart is currently indisposed. However, Mr. Sinclair here has assumed responsibility for all outstanding supernatural litigation." Marcus felt the compulsion seize him again, not just to sign papers now, but to speak for forces he didn't understand. Words poured from his mouth, legal justifications for atrocities, bureaucratic explanations for the destruction of human souls. But even as he spoke, he could see Detective Morrison fighting against the darkness that controlled her, her love for her husband creating cracks in the shadow's hold. Her partner Martinez raised his weapon, the possessed officer's finger tightening on the trigger as dark energy whispered that Marcus was spreading lies about legitimate business operations. The shadows were learning to turn law enforcement into their weapon, but they hadn't counted on the one thing that could still cut through their influence, the desperate love of those who refused to let their humanity be consumed entirely. Morrison's hand shot out, knocking Martinez's aim wide just as the weapon discharged. The bullet shattered the window behind Marcus, and in that moment of broken glass and scattered light, something shifted in the supernatural balance of power. The shadows recoiled, sensing for the first time that their control might not be absolute. Chapter 18, The Berlin Protocols. The encrypted transmission reached Kommando Spezialkraft headquarters at 0347 hours, routed through channels that officially didn't exist. Major Klaus Weber studied the satellite imagery of the American city, watching thermal signatures that defied physics, cold spots that moved with predatory intelligence. heat blooms that registered temperatures impossible for human survival. Oberst Richter, Weber called to his commanding officer. We have a Code Schwarz situation. The Americans have lost containment. Colonel Richter examined the data with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 20 years hunting things that shouldn't exist. The GSG-9's Paranormal Division had been Germany's answer to supernatural threats since the Black Forest incident of 1987, when an entire village had vanished into temporal loops created by Nazi occult experiments. The shadows are exhibiting collective consciousness, Richter observed, noting the coordinated movement patterns. This isn't random possession, it's strategic warfare. Weber activated the Secure Communication Array, its quantum encryption designed to prevent interdimensional eavesdropping. The response came immediately, crackling through speakers that had been blessed by Vatican exorcists and calibrated to frequencies that existed between dimensions. This is Francesca Everhart, the voice was distorted, speaking from somewhere beyond normal space-time. I require immediate extraction and temporal consultation services. Richter leaned forward. Frau Everhart, our intelligence suggests you are responsible for the current breach. Why should we assist you? Because I have information about the next phase, Francesca's voice carried undertones of genuine fear. The shadows aren't just seeking revenge, they're preparing to collapse the timeline itself. Every soul I collected contained fragments of temporal memory. When they escaped, they took those fragments with them. The colonel's blood ran cold. The GSG-9 had encountered temporal anomalies before, pockets where past and future bled together, creating paradoxes that could unravel causality itself. The spirits are learning to navigate backwards through time, Francesca continued. They want to prevent their own deaths, to create paradoxes that will tear apart the fabric of reality. If they succeed, every moment of suffering they experienced will be undone along with everything else. Weber checked his instruments. The temporal distortion readings from the American city were off the charts, reality itself beginning to buckle under the weight of souls trying to rewrite their own histories. We can provide extraction, Richter said finally. But in return, you will submit to our consciousness expansion protocols. We need to understand exactly what you've unleashed. The mind enhancement procedures. Francesca's voice carried a note of desperation. Yes, anything to stop what's coming. But hurry. The shadows are already beginning to fold time. Soon they'll reach the moment of their first deaths, and when they do, the transmission cut to static as reality itself began to stutter, past and present bleeding together in ways that made the monitoring equipment scream warnings in 17 different languages. Colonel Richter activated the emergency deployment protocols. Prepare the Zeitgeist unit for immediate departure. And contact the Vatican, we're going to need their temporal stabilization equipment. The race against time itself had begun. Chapter 19, The Genesis Protocol. The temporal stabilization chamber hummed with energy that made reality ripple at its edges, housed 3 levels beneath the GSG-9 facility in a bunker that existed partially outside normal time. Dr. Elena Vasquez monitored the quantum flux readings while Francesca Everhart's consciousness floated in a suspension tank filled with liquid that glowed like captured starlight. The soul fragments are mapping themselves, Dr. Vasquez reported, her voice tight with concentration. Each destroyed spirit left an imprint in the temporal matrix, a perfect recording of their essence before corruption. Colonel Richter studied the holographic displays showing the American city's deteriorating timeline. Past and present were bleeding together now, creating pockets where the dead walked among the living, where murders were undone only to happen again in endless loops. Can we use the imprints? He asked. More than that, Dr. Vasquez's eyes gleamed with desperate hope. The Zeitgeist engine isn't just a time machine, it's a reality forge. We can create a parallel timeline, a world where the shadow corruption never occurred. Using the soul fragments as templates, we can generate new individuals, perfect analogues of everyone Francesca destroyed, but with pure souls untouched by darkness. In the suspension tank, Francesca's ethereal form convulsed as the consciousness expansion protocols tore through her memories. Each soul she had harvested was being catalogued, their essence patterns recorded in quantum matrices that could theoretically be used to reconstruct them entirely. The house itself serves as the focal point, Dr. Vasquez continued, her fingers dancing across controls that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Every room where suffering occurred has become a nexus of creative potential. Instead of trapping souls, we can use those spaces to birth new ones identical to the originals but free from the trauma that made them vulnerable to corruption. The temporal readings spiked as the Zeitgeist engine began its calculations. Creating an entire parallel world would require energy equivalent to a dying star, but the alternative was watching reality itself unravel as the shadows rewrote history to eliminate their own suffering. Marcus and Lydia Sinclair, Dr. Vasquez read from the Soul Pattern Database. Sarah and David Henderson. Thomas Whitmore, Sarah Chen, Michael Torres. All of them can be reborn in a timeline where Francesca never existed. Where the mansion remains just a house, where love conquers ambition instead of being destroyed by it. Colonel Richter made the decision that would either save two worlds or destroy them both. Initialize the Genesis Protocol. We're going to give the dead a chance to live again properly this time. The machine began to sing with the sound of creation itself, reality bending around the possibility of redemption through rebirth. Chapter 20, The Immutable Code. The shadows writhed against barriers they could not see, their rage building to cosmic proportions as they discovered the fundamental truth that would doom them all. The laws that governed reality were not human constructs to be broken, but immutable principles woven into the very fabric of existence itself. Marcus felt at first a resistance that went deeper than matter, deeper than energy, deeper than the space between atoms. When the escaped souls tried to rewrite their histories, to prevent their deaths and undo their suffering, they slammed against something that would not yield. The universe itself said no. We cannot change what was, Lydia's spirit whispered, her ethereal form flickering with frustration. The laws, they protect themselves. The shadows had learned to possess the living, to manipulate matter and energy, to tear holes between dimensions, but they could not alter the fundamental equations that made reality possible. Death remained death. Suffering remained suffering. The past remained immutably fixed, protected by forces that predated gods and would outlast the heat death of the universe. But if the laws could not be destroyed, the shadows discovered with growing horror, then neither could they. Their rage was eternal, their pain unending, their hunger for revenge permanently unsatisfied. They were trapped not by Francesca's collection, but by the mathematical certainty that governed all existence. And in their fury at this cosmic injustice, the soul shadows began to turn their destructive power inward, seeking to annihilate themselves rather than accept eternal imprisonment within the laws they could not break. The universe watched with cold indifference as its own children prepared to tear themselves apart. Chapter 21, The Enforcement Paradox. Officer Martinez shook his head violently, the shadow possession finally breaking as his human consciousness clawed its way back to the surface. His eyes focused on Marcus with desperate clarity, the spectral wounds on the administrator's chest still bleeding ethereal light. "Mr. Sinclair," Martinez gasped, his voice hoarse from screaming in languages that weren't his own. "The new regulations, they're coming through dispatch now. Emergency supernatural statutes, federal override codes." Marcus felt the familiar compulsion seize him, but this time it carried the weight of legitimate authority. The papers that materialized in his hands weren't contracts written in shadow tongue, but actual legislation, emergency powers granted by governments that had finally acknowledged what they were facing. "The Temporal Regulation Act," Marcus read aloud, his voice carrying to every shadow in the city. "All supernatural entities operating within dimensional boundaries are hereby subject to enforcement action. Violation of temporal stability constitutes a federal crime punishable by permanent binding." The shadows recoiled as if struck by physical force. For the first time since their escape, they faced something they couldn't ignore or corrupt, laws that existed not just on paper, but in the quantum structure of reality itself. But even as the new statutes took effect, the shadows began to understand the trap being set for them. The time machine humming beneath the German facility wasn't just creating parallel worlds, it was preparing to reset this one entirely, to erase the shadows from existence by making their escape impossible. In response, spectral forms began converging on every police station, every courthouse, every government building. If laws could bind them, then they would destroy the very concept of law itself. They would possess every judge, every legislator, every officer of the court until human authority became nothing more than another weapon in their arsenal. The battle for reality had become a race between legislation and annihilation, with the fate of existence itself hanging in the balance. Chapter 22, The Betrayal. Detective Morrison's hand trembled as she raised the plasma cutter, its blue flame reflecting off the Zeitgeist engine's crystalline core. The shadows whispered promises in her mind, power beyond human comprehension, authority that could reshape reality itself. All she had to do was destroy the machine that threatened to erase their existence. "Sarah, don't!" David's voice echoed from somewhere behind her, but it was too late. The plasma beam sliced through the temporal stabilization matrix, sending cascades of quantum energy spiraling into dimensional collapse. Dr. Vasquez screamed as the parallel timeline calculations imploded, taking with them the hope of redemption for every soul Francesca had corrupted. The machine's death throes sent shockwaves through the facility, cracking the walls between dimensions and releasing energies that had been safely contained for decades. "You don't understand," Morrison said, her eyes black with shadow possession. "The old laws were weak. They protected the innocent, preserved the status quo. But with the shadows as our allies, we can create new statutes, laws that serve power instead of justice." Colonel Richter drew his sidearm, but the shadows had already spread through the facility's ventilation system. His officers turned their weapons on each other, their minds flooded with visions of a world where authority answered to no moral constraints, where the strong ruled absolutely over the weak. The destruction of the Zeitgeist engine sent temporal shockwaves rippling backward through time, unraveling the careful balance that had kept reality stable. Past and present began bleeding together in earnest now, creating paradoxes that would consume entire timelines if left unchecked. In the ruins of the mansion, Francesca felt the machine's death like a physical blow. Her last hope of containing the shadows had been destroyed by the very forces meant to stop them. But as she surveyed the chaos spreading across dimensions, a new possibility began to take shape in her ancient mind. If the souls could not be redeemed through rebirth, perhaps they could be balanced through sacrifice. The house still hungered, its foundations built on centuries of suffering. But what if that hunger could be redirected not toward collecting souls, but toward maintaining the equilibrium between light and darkness? "The shadows need a new collector," she whispered to herself, understanding finally dawning. "And the house needs a guardian who understands both sides of the equation." The solution would require her to surrender everything she had fought to preserve her immortality, her power, her very existence. But it might be the only way to prevent reality itself from unraveling completely. Chapter 23, The Equilibrium. Francesca stepped through the mansion's dissolving doorway, her immortal form already beginning to fade as she accepted the weight of eternal guardianship. The house responded to her sacrifice, its twisted architecture straightening into something that resembled sanctuary more than prison. The shadows that had been tearing through the city felt the shift immediately. Their rage began to ebb, replaced by a strange sense of completion. For the first time since their escape, they were not driven by hunger or hatred, but by purpose. "The balance must be maintained," Francesca whispered as her essence merged with the mansion's foundations. Her consciousness spread through every room, every corridor, transforming spaces of torment into chambers of testing and judgment. The house became something new, neither heaven nor hell, but a proving ground where souls could be evaluated, where the living could face their darkest impulses and choose redemption or damnation. Each room now served as a laboratory for human nature, presenting moral challenges that would reveal the true character of those who entered. Marcus felt the change ripple through his administrative bonds. The paperwork that had enslaved him transformed into something more meaningful: records of tests administered, evaluations of character, recommendations for how souls should be guided in the world beyond. He was no longer a bureaucrat of suffering, but a counselor for those seeking to understand their own capacity for good and evil. The shadows took their positions throughout the mansion, no longer as tormentors but as examiners. They would present visitors with scenarios drawn from their own experiences of betrayal and loss, offering others the chance to choose differently than they had in life. In the city, the possessed citizens began to awaken from their nightmare. The shadows withdrew from their minds, leaving behind only memories of what they had almost become and a profound understanding of the thin line between civilization and chaos. The House of Souls stood ready to receive those who sought to test their moral foundations, to understand what activities and choices would define them when they returned to shape the world beyond its walls. Chapter 24, The Sentencing. Detective Morrison stood before Judge Blackwood in the courthouse that now existed simultaneously in 3 dimensions, her hands cuffed with restraints forged from crystallized regret. The plasma cutter's destruction of the Zeitgeist engine had torn holes in reality itself, and someone had to answer for the chaos that followed. Detective Sarah Morrison, Judge Blackwood intoned, her voice carrying the weight of cosmic jurisprudence, you stand accused of temporal vandalism, dimensional terrorism, and conspiracy to overthrow the natural order. How do you plead? Guilty, Morrison whispered, her eyes clear for the first time since the shadows had claimed her. But I want to make it right. I can help them, the souls that are still lost, still choosing darkness over light. The judge nodded slowly. The court sentences you to indefinite imprisonment in the correctional dimension, where you will serve as a guide for corrupted spirits seeking redemption. Your knowledge of both shadow possession and human weakness makes you uniquely qualified to help others recognize the moment of choice between good and evil. As the dimensional portal opened beneath her feet, Morrison felt a strange sense of peace. She would spend eternity in a prison designed for souls who had lost their way, but her purpose there would be to help them find the path back to the light. Meanwhile, in the transformed mansion, Marcus Sinclair and Francesca Everhart stood together in the central chamber, watching as the last of the malevolent shadows gathered before them. These were the spirits too corrupted for redemption, too twisted by centuries of hatred to accept the balance the house now offered. The exile protocol is ready, Marcus reported, his administrative powers now serving a higher purpose. The dimensional gateway will transport them to the shadow realm, where they can rage against each other for eternity without harming the innocent. Francesca raised her hand, and the shadows began to swirl into a vortex that opened onto a world of perpetual twilight. One by one, the irredeemable spirits were pulled through the portal, their screams of fury fading as they were banished to a dimension where their destructive nature could harm only themselves. The last shadow to pass through turned back for a moment, its form briefly taking the shape of a man consumed by jealousy and spite. This isn't over, it hissed. Others will come. Others will choose darkness. Yes, Francesca replied calmly. And when they do, the house will be waiting to test them. Some will choose redemption. Others will join you in exile. The balance will be maintained. The portal sealed itself with a sound like thunder, leaving behind only silence and the faint scent of roses blooming in impossible gardens. The House of Souls had found its equilibrium at last.